state organizations and also from national organizations. So we're going to give you all a what we hope to be a comprehensive view from multiple angles on the homelessness issue. And we're going to have a brief break, about 10 minutes after about an hour of the presentation, followed at the end by questions. And so first off, we have Tristia Bauman from the National Homelessness Law Center. She's going to give a national perspective on homelessness and models for solving the issue. Tristia?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to keep my remarks brief. And first, I'll say that the National Homelessness Law Center has been around for about 30 years. We're the only national legal organization whose sole mission is to prevent and end homelessness using the power of the law. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we, as I said, work across the country. My comments are really going to focus on causes of homelessness to orient us as to why there is such a large homeless crisis in this country, and to point to some of the specific causes that will likely resonate with you in Jackson because they are true based on data nationally. So let me pull up my PowerPoint. I'm going to share my screen. And I have a few slides here. And I'll start the slideshow. So, the goal is to understand homelessness and why there are so many people living outside. The primary cause of homelessness, and this is backed up by research that you can find in a report that we have issued, Housing Not Handcuffs 2019. I'll put a link to that report in the chat for anyone who's interested. The primary cause of homelessness is a lack of housing that's affordable and accessible to human beings that need housing. There is no place in the entire country where someone who is working full-time, earning the federal minimum wage, can afford even a one-bedroom apartment without being housing cost burdened, meaning that they don't pay more than 30% of their entire income on housing expenses alone. And cost burden is something that we'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment, but it's important that we understand that housing is simply unaffordable, especially to our lowest income workers. In fact, a full-time worker earning the federal minimum wage would need to work the equivalent of 2.5 jobs every week of the year, all 52 weeks of the year, in order to afford a one-bedroom home. And by home, I'm referring to an apartment and rental housing. And all of the data that I focus on today is going to be on rental housing. Homeowners, of course, also do experience homelessness, but the majority of people who are living outside now were poor renters before and will be poor renters afterward. The problem of housing unaffordability is only increasing. Rents are increasing in some places dramatically from year to year, 40% increases in rental housing from year to year, and that's just not sustainable. We are seeing the gap between incomes and the cost of housing come to clear focus as we all nationwide deal with the fallout, well, worldwide, deal with the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time that housing is unaffordable, especially to our lowest income workers, the social safety net, the federal social safety net, has been shrinking. And that's a process that began in the early 1980s, and federal funds have decreased steadily since that time. We lose about 10,000 subsidized units every year, and those units haven't been replaced, even as the number of people who are eligible, income eligible for those units, has increased. So today, only 1 in 4 eligible households receives any form of subsidy, federal or otherwise. And in some cities, there are really long wait lists for any type of housing subsidy, whether that be a voucher to allow somebody to go rent in the private market or access to a public housing unit. In some cities, the wait lists are in the tens of thousands, and the wait lists can even just be closed for years at a time, where there's just no possibility of getting an income support for housing. All of this means that there just is not enough housing available for people who need it. So one statistic that I hope you'll take away from today is that for every 35 affordable housing units affordable and available, well, actually, let me restate the statistic in a way that makes more sense. For every 100 affordable and accessible households to the most low income families, only 35 are available to them. So that means 65 different households, individuals and families cannot access a home that's affordable and available to them without being housing cost burdened, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their income toward rent. Now, anybody who's a renter in the audience is probably familiar with housing cost burdens, because nearly half of all renters across the income spectrum are housing cost burdened right now. I mean, housing is just unaffordable really to people across all incomes. But when you are an extremely low income renter, meaning that you earn 30% of the area median income or less, those housing cost burdens are severe, meaning you pay over half of your monthly income just toward rent and to those household expenses to keep the roof over your head. And what that means is that you have very little financial cushion for any of life's events, prolonged illness, divorce, job loss, or to absorb the effect of the pandemic. And all of that makes people vulnerable to eviction. And right now, as a result of the pandemic and the conditions that preceded it, there are 30 to 40 million US moratorium on evictions. But for that, there would be 30 or 40 households that are looking at losing their housing. And an eviction on someone's record can function as a permanent bar to ever securing additional housing. So eviction is not only an immediate cause of homelessness and that it displaces somebody from the housing that they have, it also can make them ineligible essentially for housing because of rental policies, rental admission policies. Disclose that you had an eviction on your history, or they will find when they do a background check that you have an eviction on your history, and that you'll be passed over in favor of another renter who does not have that sort of history. And in that way, evictions can entrench homelessness. I'll try to move more quickly and also mention that when you are unhoused, when you lack permanent housing, in many communities, there is an emergency shelter option. It does not exist in all communities, and it doesn't exist for all populations. For example, fathers with minor children don't have many options countrywide for any type of emergency shelter. People with severe mobility issues, meaning people in wheelchairs who need assistance to getting on and off of a bed or on and off of a toilet, are turned away at the door because there's not sufficient staffing and appropriate staffing at the emergency shelter to serve that person. So for some populations, there is no emergency shelter. But even where there is shelter available, it's really important for us to keep in mind that shelter is not housing. It's temporary. It's usually available only overnight. It can't often accommodate your partners. It'll divide people on the basis of sex, so it'll separate men and women, even married couples or families. It, parents and children. It can't accommodate people's possessions or their pets. And what all of that means is that a lot of people are literally left with no option but to live outside. And in fact, today across the country, 1 in 3 people experiencing homelessness is not in a shelter. They are living on a street, in a park, under a bridge, in a car, or some other place not meant for human habitation. There are certain demographics that are disproportionately harmed by the homelessness crisis and affected by the homelessness crisis. And I'll go over a couple of those subpopulations. People of color, for example, make up 60% of the homeless population in this country. And of those, 40% of all people experiencing homelessness in this country are Black. Even though Black people make up 13% of the general population, they are 40% of the homeless population. And there are a lot of ugly reasons for that. Also, people with disabilities are disproportionately homeless. And when we refer to people who are disabled, we're referring both to mental health disabilities as well as physical disabilities. Uh, Again, 40% of all unhoused people nationwide are people with disabilities who don't have access, because our country doesn't often offer it, have access to the type of mental health care and physical care that they need in order to remain stably housed or to become rehoused. The criminal justice system is also a driver of homelessness. It's one that has the collateral consequence of resulting in new homelessness or entrenched homelessness. And it does that in a couple of different ways. One, when a person is unhoused, they're 11 times more likely to be arrested and incarcerated than a housed person. That's based on nationwide data. Once you have any type of conviction on your record, again, in the same way that evictions can function, you can be turned down for rental housing. Just on the basis of that conviction, no matter how old it is, no matter what it's for, it just makes you less competitive in highly competitive rental markets, which increasingly they are. Uh, it also can make you ineligible for subsidized housing. So again, public housing authorities have a lot of discretion as to how they determine who gets a subsidy or not. And people who have even old misdemeanor convictions can be turned down for assistance, or somebody who picks up a conviction while in an assisted unit. Again, no matter the charge, even if it's totally unrelated to being a safe and responsible renter, can be terminated, have their subsidy terminated on that basis. It also has a number of other consequences that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. Even an arrest on someone's record can make them an undesirable candidate and be turned down for employment opportunities. Being incarcerated can result in people's benefits being suspended. And when someone is released from custody, they are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness after release. And in that way, the criminal justice system, along with some of the other factors that we talked about, drives homelessness. So, how do we solve the problem? You're going to hear a lot more about law enforcement specific solutions to homelessness from Officer Dan McDonald, who we're so lucky to have with us today. But I wanted to touch briefly on some of the big picture issues. One, it's important that we all recognize that homelessness is solvable. I know it feels like an intractable problem, and many of us, I'm 44, many of us who are my age, we grew up with it. We've never imagined a world that doesn't have homelessness. So it's hard to remember that there was a time where we did not have a national homelessness crisis, and we know what solves homelessness. Housing ultimately is the solution to homelessness, and there are housing interventions that work, that not only work to keep people off the streets, out of parks, out from under bridges, but also produces better outcomes, not only for them, where they have better educational attainment goals met, they have better health outcomes, they're able to be employed and to be stable, productive members of society, but they're also better community-wide benefits. For example, governments save money when housing is the solution that's invested in. There is an upfront investment, but it pays dividends over the long term. And in fact, the longer that people remain housed, the more money that governments save that would otherwise go toward just managing outdoor homelessness. Not to mention the public health and safety benefits that are involved with making sure that all human beings have access to four walls and a roof. Uh, with respect to law enforcement, I'll just give sort of the premise that what has worked is people working together, an interdisciplinary approach. Uh, Homelessness is not a criminal justice problem. It's been turned into a criminal justice problem because police have been relied upon to solve the social crisis, the economic crisis of homelessness. You're the first responders when there's a complaint about homelessness. And we all know there are a lot of complaints about homelessness and homeless people. But police are enforcers of public safety. You are law enforcement. You are not providers of housing. You're not given the resources and the tools that you would need in order to perform the task that has been put before you. So this interdisciplinary approach has been successful in other places. And by interdisciplinary, I mean not only law enforcement, but medics, mental health care professionals, social workers, people who are really familiar with the social services infrastructure in a given community can work together in order to be first responders to homelessness and to help somebody leave the location where they're outside because they have no choice but to be there, and to find an other stable, safe, secure location where they can either immediately become permanently housed or have the stability, safety, and dignity that they need in order to eventually become permanently housed and remain so. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Josh, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tristia. I know a lot of you in the audience can recognize some of the issues that Tristia highlighted that are occurring across the nation are also occurring in Mississippi and in the Jackson metro area. And, one brief comment about what Tristia closed with, several years ago after some events that happened in Dallas, the then Dallas, Texas Chief of Police David Brown said this quote: "We're asking cops to do too much in this country. Every societal failure, we put it on the cops to solve. Not enough mental health funding, let the cop handle it. Not enough drug addiction funding, let's give it to the cops. Here in Dallas, we've got a loose dog problem. Let's have the cops chase loose dogs. Schools fail, give it to the cops. 70% of the African American community is being raised by single women. Let's give it to the cops to solve that as well. That's too much to ask. Policing was never meant to solve all of those problems." And when you have that type of burden placed on cops, this homelessness issue falls right within what Tristia said and what Chief Brown said. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Landon Thames, who's the staff attorney at the ACLU of Mississippi, and he's going to talk about homelessness in Mississippi and in the Jackson area. Landon?
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for having us. As Josh mentioned, I'm the staff attorney here at the ACLU of Mississippi. And for those of you who may not know, the ACLU stands for the American Civil Liberties Union of Mississippi. We are dedicated to promoting, defending, and extending civil liberties to all Mississippians. We have an emphasis on issues related to things such as criminal justice reform, voting rights, equal access, governmental transparency, etc. And we hope that our mission can achieve the goal that will ensure all Mississippians enjoy a just and equitable Mississippi free from discrimination. And as Josh mentioned, I'll be talking about homelessness in Jackson specifically, also some constitutional issues that may arise in that context, and also some systems and programs that have worked in some of our sister states and also in Mississippi. So I will share my screen and we can get started. So I think it's important to go over a few statistics. There are over 600 homeless people currently living in Jackson, Mississippi. The poverty rate of Jackson in 2019 was right around 27%, compared with the state average of 20% and the national average of right around 10%. These numbers have likely increased during the pandemic. Also, as of January 2019, Mississippi had an estimated 1,184 people experiencing homelessness on any given day. And also I think it's important to note that it's not just adults who are homeless. I know we usually picture an adult person when we think of someone who's homeless, but public school data from 2017 to 2018 show that an estimated 9,815 public school students in Mississippi alone experienced homelessness over the course of the year. And now we can move into some constitutional issues. Our colleague Brett Frazer from Latham Watkins is going to touch on the First Amendment more fully later. So I'll just mention this briefly with respect to some specific Mississippi laws. But it's important to mention that homeless people, like all people, have rights, including those guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. And that also includes the right to ask the public for money. And looking at some specific Mississippi laws, Mississippi's tramp and vagrancy laws, before they were repealed, these laws were unconstitutional for the same reasons as Jackson's panhandling ordinances. They infringed on a person's First Amendment right to ask for money in a public place. They were actually enacted as part of Mississippi's black codes, which in essence worked to oppress and criminalize people of color in Mississippi. They were used, the tramp and vagrancy laws have been used along with Jackson's ordinances to restrict and criminalize the free speech of homeless persons. Homeless people in Mississippi have been targeted and discriminated against for decades, at least going back to the black codes. I think were enacted around the middle of the 19th century. And we'll take a deeper dive into the Fourth Amendment here. Jackson's homeless population, like everyone else in America, is protected under the Fourth Amendment. They should be free from excessive use of force, unreasonable search and seizure, false arrest, and false imprisonment. So homeless people have the constitutional right to ask for money without being abused, harassed, or arrested. They may not be subject to a stop unless an officer has an articulable reason to believe that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed. They can be stopped for questioning as long as they are free to leave at any time. Without an articulable reason of a criminal act, a homeless person cannot be detained, searched, or arrested because they are asking the public for money, because they didn't stop and ask to, or because they refused to answer questions, or because they simply chose to walk away. Homeless people may not be subject to any harassment or abuse simply because they are homeless, or because they are just asking the public for money. And even under arrest, a homeless person may not be subject to excessive force. Only reasonable force should be used to effectuate an arrest. Also, during an arrest, a homeless person is entitled to have all of their effects, including their clothes and shoes, held for safekeeping until such time as they are released from jail, and those effects can be returned to them. Research shows that enforcing laws targeted at homeless individuals through citation, arrest, or other means are ineffective. And these laws can be, for example, panhandling laws, anti-sleeping laws, anti-eating, anti-sitting. Rather, these approaches cost money, they cost cities money, they perpetuate poverty, and provide only temporary relief instead of a sustainable remedy. The way we've always done it just simply has not worked. And now we can go through some things, that have worked across the country. Things such as coalition building, officer training, engaging with social workers. There are features of model programs through which law enforcement agencies, have successfully combated homelessness. When law enforcement, work with behavioral health providers and other service providers closely, they can divert people who are unsheltered to programs that both address the issues that cause their homelessness and also facilitate access to permanent housing. These are some actual strategies that have worked. In 2015, the city of Gulfport in Mississippi on the coast brought veteran homelessness to a functional zero through a partnership between the city, the Open Door Homeless Coalition, which is a Gulfport-based group, and Community Solutions Built for Zero, which is a national movement working throughout the country. Amongst other things, Gulfport and its partners created a system to connect homeless veterans with mental health centers when those services were necessary, and they even made appointments for the centers to see the homeless people, the homeless veterans. And looking more broadly to see that, you know, we can have success even in large cities. Atlanta has a poverty rate of around 22%. It rises to over 30% in surrounding counties. But despite this, Atlanta's homeless population decreased by over 40% between the 5-year span of 2011 and 2016, which also the unsheltered population decreased by 15% from 35 to 20 over that same 5-year period. And the Atlanta Police Department had a major role with its homeless outreach proactive enforcement, or its HOPE team. And the progress that Atlanta has made is a result of several factors, including a housing first approach to homelessness, connecting individuals with social services, work internship programs, and advanced casework with incarcerated individuals that helps with successful reentry into society. And take a little deeper dive into HOPE strategy. HOPE strategy did not involve arresting people, but rather engaging with them to see what resources they needed. Atlanta PD, they knew that arrest had not reduced Atlanta's homeless population, so they thought coordinated social services might, and they did. The HOPE team now has 7 officers who engage in outreach to homeless individuals in an attempt to create a long-term relationship and connect people with services such as mental health, addiction, and also with housing. And it's important to note that HOPE success depends on partnerships with other local service providers. And this includes the United Way of Greater Atlanta, Mercy Care, the Salvation Army, HOPE Atlanta, Grady Memorial Hospital, and the Atlanta VA Medical Center, amongst others. So addressing homelessness in Jackson, we believe, you know, the city of Jackson is in a unique position to be a leader and an example in ending homelessness within its jurisdiction. The city has leaders at all levels of municipal and county government who would likely be open to creating a program similar to Atlanta's. Indeed, Jackson is already dedicated to solving homelessness. Just this past fall, in September 2020, the Jackson City Council provided Stupot a $12,000 matching grant to house homeless individuals during severe cold weather. The city of Jackson also has a homelessness initiative to eradicate homelessness. Its strategy includes providing housing and connecting people to services that they need. You can see a list of the homeless partners below. And, you know, there are also other partnerships to be made in addressing the issue of homelessness, such as, you know, the Hinds County DA, Hinds County Public Defender's Office, Jackson PD, and many others, Hinds County Sheriff's Department. So we should be asking ourselves, you know, what other partners can we include? Can we create a regional collaboration and response? Can Jackson and its partners become a model for addressing homelessness in Mississippi and hopefully across the country? Also, you know, we encourage you, please use, you know, us, the ACLU, as a resource. You know, we're here to help. We're happy to help. And we have our email address and our phone number listed here. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I believe that's all I have. I'll turn it back over to Josh. Thank you all again.
Great. Thanks, Landon. Now, to point out, you know, we are running a little bit behind. You know, we still hope to get you all out of here on time. You know, we think towards the end, some of the time will be made up. And so, you know, I'm not trying to take away any other presenters' time. Please speak as long as you want. But I do believe that, you know, certain of the presenters will be a little bit shorter than what is listed on the agenda. And next up, we have Tampa Police Department Officer Daniel McDonald, who over his career, amongst other things, has specialized in dealing with homelessness and creating alternative approaches towards homelessness. And actually, Officer McDonald, after a long law enforcement career, is soon to retire. And so, you know, we all thank him for his service.
8 days left.
8 days. Well, Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Joshua. Yeah, hi everyone. Dan McDonald. I'm a police officer at Tampa Police Department. Been there 23 years. Also worked in corrections for about 6 years prior to that. Like I said, I've got 8 days left before I retire. I expand my consulting business part-time or to full-time. You might have seen my work in People Magazine or Today's Show. I've been spoken at IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. So I kind of get around a lot. So anyway, you'll see a lot of common themes here, which is about collaboration and community engagement. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. So I share my screen here about improving police responses to homelessness, because it is possible. I'm going to give you some ideas about what you can do. Let's see here. Here we go. You see my screen okay, hopefully. So I'm going to show you a little clip. This is recorded in Tampa. This could be any city. This could be in Jackson. Tell me if this looks familiar. That's an actual video that got sent to us, and I dealt with this. Pay attention to the gentleman on the left side of the screen with red hair, called Red. I'm going to talk to him about him a bit later. So my job and what I've been doing for the last 9 years as a homeless liaison officer is translating this problem into solutions, particularly in street homelessness, dealing with homeless camps. As you can probably tell here, for those of you who are not detectives, this gentleman had a bit of an alcohol problem, which substance abuse is a very large component of homelessness. Particularly we as law enforcement officers, we are very often dealing with the chronically homelessness. And that is generally about 15 to 20% of the homeless population. For every 1 or 2 homeless that you see on the streets or you get calls for service on, there's another 4 or 5 that you may not see, the families, the fathers with children, et cetera, et cetera. So, in particular, the chronic homelessness, they drive the calls for service, they drive the citizen complaints, they drive the calls to the chief's office, the mayor's office, commissioners, et cetera, et cetera. And they also tend to be very expensive. So you have about 20% of the homeless population consuming often about 80% of the resources. And this, for those of you who've been working in law enforcement for quite a while, and as we've already talked about here, you'll see many drivers behind homelessness that some we've already discussed about. We're dealing with behavioral health, mental health issues. We're dealing with socioeconomic variables, which is lack of affordable housing. We're dealing with addictions, opioids, alcohol, heroin, you name it. Jail, the criminalization of homelessness is jails are a very expensive mental health institution in just about every community. So this becomes a very expensive problem. And like the previous friends have mentioned, it also has become a police problem. I think homelessness is not necessarily in itself a problem. It is a symptom of bigger problems, such as some of these issues. And we as the police get called to address this and just about every other societal problem. Particularly in the homeless population, one of the reasons why homelessness is expensive and why I'm going to be presenting some of the solutions that I'm going to talk about here shortly, and why I've been doing what I do for the last 9 years, is because we're dealing with a very expensive population, a very high need population. These are what we call high utilizers or high need, high utilizers folks, is often pejoratively known as frequent flyers. I'm sure if you've been around for a while, you've heard that term. We're dealing with population with many with addictions. Most have mental illness. Many have chronic health conditions. Many trimorbid, which means they have a combination of all of them. So in many communities, the hospital emergency rooms have become the de facto primary care provider for the homeless population, and that becomes very expensive. Particularly now we're dealing with a pandemic, so homelessness during COVID-19 is a even bigger issue. We have the kind of the intersection of coronavirus. We have the unsheltered homelessness out there on the streets. We have folks with chronic health conditions, mental illness, addictions. When you bring all that together, you have just a perfect storm of risk and expense and problems and public health issues and criminal justice issues and et cetera, et cetera. But there is good news. I have solutions for that. I found in my research that many communities have basically three responses to homelessness. If you remember sociology from high school, I just kind of got this idea from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Many communities, and perhaps most of them, just choose to maintain the status quo on their homeless policy. In other words, do nothing. It's tried and true, but unfortunately, it's not very effective. Then we can also get to managing homelessness, which is, that usually falls under the arresting the homelessness, arrest away the problem, take them to jail, make the homeless shoo them off somewhere else, build shelters, and shelters can be good, but they can also be bad depending on how you run them and what outcomes you desire. Ultimately, we have what hopefully your community in Jackson and Hinds County is going toward, which is homeless solutions. And that is puts you in kind of the top of the pyramid, the elite of the communities out there that don't want to manage the problem anymore. Particularly nowadays, it's also a good way to get sued. I'm certainly not a lawyer, but many of the courts are favoring the homeless in litigation, such as some of the recent court decisions, such as Boise versus Martin, or some of the other older court decisions. We won't go into that too much now, but basically it's time to, you can't arrest away the problem. Like some of the others have said, you need to have a homeless solutions. So how did this become a police problem? Like anything else in society, the police get calls for everything. But these days, you can no longer stay in your lane. It's not going to work anymore. In a perfect world, the police would not be called to respond to homelessness. But that's just the reality. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have a pandemic. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have lack of affordable housing. But we have to play the hand that has been dealt to us. So that is why it's a good time to look at homeless solutions. In many communities just, well, we'll just wait for them to disappear. Well, if that hasn't worked before, what makes you think it's going to work now? It's not. You might be getting pressure from your bosses or elected officials. Do something, do anything. You need to look at new solutions. Like I said, homelessness, like it or not, it's become a police problem. So you can pick up a plan that works, homeless outreach team, and I'll talk about a little more, and co-responding models, etc. You can't arrest away the problem. This is a common theme I run into quite a bit. If you have an effective homeless policy, you'll bring more. Sort of the field of dreams, build it and they will come. That's not necessarily the case. Studies have shown that homeless tend to become homeless in that community. They don't, it's not an absolute, but most homeless generally will not travel for services or travel for better locations or cities to be homeless. So if you're looking for one that works, then I've got some ideas for you. In terms of ending homelessness, one of the big reasons for having a homeless outreach team, which is what I do, is basically it's a money saver. That ultimately, at the end of the day, we are saving resources. Homelessness, for some of the reasons I've mentioned, so the high utilizers, is very expensive. In most communities, about $30,000 per person per year. If you go to some other big cities like New York City or Los Angeles, that can go up to about $50,000 or $60,000 a year. Now, if you put someone in permanent housing, which is called Housing First, that drops that down to about $12,000 per year in most communities, depending upon what community and the cost of housing. But ultimately, just by getting someone off the streets into housing, you're going to save a ton of money. And ultimately, That's why I do this. It's good public policy. It saves a great deal of money. It's also saving calls for service. So basically, ultimately, at the end of the day, if there's no other reason than that I can sell you on today, it's that you're going to save a ton of money by having an effective homeless policy. Because if not, it's going to get more and more expensive. Like some of my colleagues have mentioned, you can't arrest away to homelessness. It's not very effective, and it's a good way to get litigation against you. There's one study from Portland State University that discovered that for every dollar that you invest in reducing homelessness, it has a net savings of $13 in savings, criminal justice system costs. That is often because incarceration is expensive. If you have someone that is incarcerated because they robbed a bank, well, yeah, there's definitely a need for that. They should be there. But if you have someone in jail for a sort of a nuisance crime that is perhaps a symptom of a bigger problem, then why incarcerate them over and over again and hoping for a different result? It's not going to happen. A study in Long Beach, California, studied that half of the high-frequency arrestees have access to homeless services. So what that means is you have a huge kind of untapped market of folks that you can get to and potentially assist and get them off the streets. And then you're going to reduce your jail costs and criminal justice costs, court costs, probation, et cetera, et cetera. Wet shelters and mental health receiving facilities are also an excellent alternative to arrest, and they can also be used as a pathway from homelessness into housing. I'll talk about a little bit more about that coming up here shortly. One gentleman I talk about here is in the middle of the photo. I'm to the right of him. I call him $1 Million Billy after $1 Million Mario, which is a widely cited gentleman from Reno, Nevada, who was estimated to cost the system about $1 million. Billy is the most prolific offender in the county, Hillsborough County, where I work. He's pushing about 200 jail bookings since 1995, and that's never for anything more than a misdemeanor. In other words, it's county jail time. It's not prison time. It's stuff like drinking in public, trespassing, etc., kind of minor nuisance crimes like that. He spent an aggregate of 10 years in the Hillsborough County Jail, 30, 60, 90 days at a time, sort of life on the installment plan. And in our facility, we've had 5,000 high-frequency arrestees that have been booked over 20 times. These are homeless folks. And my county jail costs about $125 a day. So you put them into housing and you're going to reduce that by quite a lot. You'll see here, as my colleagues have alluded to, this is all about community collaborations. I, as the police, don't have a product or a service. I'm sort of like Google for the homeless or 911 for the homeless. You call me and I will kind of like navigate you through the system. It takes a community and it takes resources. It also takes money too, but you're going to save a lot of money. Spend some money now, you'll save a lot of money in the long run. Remember the gentleman you saw in the video at the beginning? That is red. I call him the Mount Everest of homelessness. He is no longer, I got him off the streets. It took me 4.5 years. It took me that amount of time was what it took him to decide that he wanted to get off the streets. Every first of every month on check day, him and his friends would be pushing him down our Kennedy Boulevard, one of our main streets in Tampa, going to the liquor store, and they'd spend his check. He got sick of being ripped off and called me, and after that, housing him was relatively simple. He's in a wheelchair. He is very expensive to keep on the streets. So got him off the streets, and it saves a ton of money. And he's also not generating calls for service like the video you saw at the beginning, because he's no longer on the street, so he's no longer generating nuisance crimes and citizen complaints. So how do you get started on this? What do you do? This sounds great, Dan, but what do I do now? Well, I spent about 20,000 hours over the last 9 years studying the problem, so give you some ideas. Like I said, if you're not what you have been doing doesn't work, it's time for a good change. It's time for change. Homeless outreach teams is what I do, which is actually the police or my community were the primary homeless outreach provider for many years until some of the other organizations got involved as well. So the police were the de facto responses, so we ended up solving the problem. I did this with no budget other than my salary and equipment, and homelessness is down, street homelessness, about 40% in our community, I think, last time we checked. We do this by linking, by solving the problem. Really, it comes down to we're dealing with folks that have a problem, which is often lack of housing. So how do I solve that problem? It's basically problem solving is what it is. We use Housing First, which was established in the 1990s. Success rate's about 85%. Many people think Housing First is, particularly since I have, some people think I look like a young version of Bernie Sanders. People think I'm just, this is enabling bad behavior. This is enabling homelessness. This is just giving out free stuff for everyone. Cops I know are a particularly conservative bunch, but Housing First is actually a Republican invention during the Bush administration back in the 90s. So it's not a political issue. It's a human rights issue. It is a public policy issue. It's a criminal justice issue, and it's a money-saving issue. So it's a win-win for everyone. The police, in my role, I'm kind of the none of the above. You have to think outside the box. And I'm not gonna lie to you, homelessness it's a complex system. You're dealing with a challenging system to overcome, but it's very impossible. And what my job is, I help my clients. There's a lot of pejoratives for the homeless out there. You know them all. I'm not going to say them now, but so I call them my clients. It gives them a little bit of dignity and respect, and I help them solve the problems and navigate the system. So homeless and hungry, don't know where to go, call me. There was one study here, one of our first apartment complexes, which was Housing First. And the whole concept behind Housing First is you don't have to go through the shelter system. You don't have to graduate through programs. You don't have to become sober. You don't have to manage your mental health issues. We put people into housing and then work on their issues after that, not the other way around. You don't have to prove sobriety to get housed. We'll work on that once you're housed. That's a concept called harm reduction. One of the studies first showed that it's very effective. This is conducted by the University of Tampa. Emergency room visits were down by 81%. Detox services down by 100%. Jail bookings down by 83%. Emergency shelter, which they're housed, they don't need shelter anymore, is down by 100%. So the total net reduction in public services was 94%. This is a fairly small sample size, 17 people. That's about a 24, I've been there, about a 24 unit complex. And these statistics have been mirrored many times over and over in other studies. So it's a very cost-effective system. It's a very effective use of public policy, and it's a very effective use of police resources. Particularly now during a pandemic, we are dealing with very potentially expensive responses to COVID. If you look towards the right hand of the scale, if you have this could be anyone, but particularly the homeless, if they need to be hospitalized due to COVID, you're looking about, at least where I am, about $2,000 a day for a hospital bed, or about $10,000 a day for an ICU bed. So, and if you go down from there, there are many other ways of saving money on the unsheltered homelessness. You can put them in motels. There's a lot of funding for that, for the COVID CARES funding. We had a tent city for a little while to get everyone off the streets until they moved into housing. So you'll see that being homeless on the streets is costing about $82 a day. And that's the cheapest response to homelessness is permanent housing. So If you look at all those different alternatives to street homelessness, housing is actually the cheapest. So that's why it's a big money saver, particularly now. Anyway, some of the homeless outreach teams is going to combine many elements of other approaches to policing that many of you might be familiar with, such as community-oriented policing, problem-oriented policing, and intelligence-led policing, which is very popular and effective today. For the same reason that you can map all your auto burglaries or your retail thefts and kind of see where the hotspots are, you can do the same thing with homelessness. This is a map of homeless hotspots, and we can sort of use that to better focus our resources on where we need to go and try and solve the problem. So crime analysis, crime mapping is not just for auto burglaries or house burglary. You can use it for homeless as well. You know, use data for use it for you to help you make decisions on whether to develop and devote resources. Particularly, like I mentioned, that's me on the right there a few years ago. Starting out was my colleague on the left from the sheriff's office, who has since retired. We work sort of a task force approach with our adjacent sheriff's office. That's why Hinds County and City of Jackson. If you're looking and doing something like this, work together. Me and Steve on the left there, we made the decision to kind of apply the same methods and tactics that way, because we have homeless, they'll call and they don't like Dan sucks, I'll call Steve, or vice versa. We use a consistent approach, and it's a lot easier to use the same resources and systems, et cetera. Some other things we use: trauma-informed approach, motivational interviewing, and assertive engagement. That's kind of beyond the scope of what we're doing here. You may have used them, you just don't know what they were called. That is some very specific methods of engaging the homeless or people with mental health issues, people with addictions, and so on. But I'm not going to go into too much of that now. So you think this is a great idea? You're going to you're going to want to get the kind of the right officers, deputies, et cetera, for this. You're going to get folks that with a lot of patience, compassion, communication skills, networker, problem solving skills, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to kind of get the right fit for that. This is kind of important. You want to dedicate officers exclusively to homeless outreach. You can't be viewed as hypocritical. You can't be making arrests Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but helping the homeless Tuesday and Thursday. It often takes a while to develop the trust. It takes about 15 to 20 contacts or more to overcome resistance for getting help from the police or otherwise. This is very time consuming, so just be prepared for that, and it can be occasionally frustrating. I'm not going to lie to you on that, but it's also very rewarding. I don't make arrests. I haven't made an arrest in 9 years or written a ticket. If someone else will come and do that if necessary, and it doesn't seem to affect their perception of me. And you can wear I suggest wearing a uniform. It can be a softer approach to the golf shirt, but some agencies use plain clothes, but I wouldn't recommend that. There's been studies on that. So basically, oftentimes, basically progressive engagement is you look for the simple solution. You do the easy way, the hard way, do it the easy way. This lady sleeping here, she had a falling out with her sister. I just drove her home. I solved this problem in about 20 minutes. Ultimately, you want to end up focusing on the end results. Particularly in homelessness, there is very much a focus on busy work or activity. Ultimately, it's going to be what your performance is and what the outcomes are, and that's very important. Many of you have a crisis intervention team. If you have that, then you're kind of halfway there. You're dealing with officers that will often be used to dealing with the population. Now is a good time to expand this into homeless outreach. You might already have relationships with the community partners. So if you have CIT, then this is a good natural progression. You can also use co-responder models. That's kind of a very hot topic right about now. Just keep in mind, particularly mental health co-responder models are very popular. Just keep in mind that a very small percentage of the population is homeless, those with mental health issues or otherwise. So if you're kind of looking for a one-size-fits-all approach with a mental health correspondent model, is not necessarily going to be it. It can be a component of homeless outreach, and they should very much work together, but don't think it's going to be a one-size-fits-all. There are differences to that. But definitely, if I could pick a correspondent, it would be a housing specialist like Joanna here on the left with my former partner there. There's money out there. I regularly hear BJA and Bureau of Justice Administration complaining they're not getting enough applicants for their grant funding. So that we started, I got my first partner was funded by a grant from Bureau of Justice Assistance. So there is out there, SAMHSA, COVID CARES funding. So there is money out there. If you, we all don't have enough money in our budget. So look out there for grant funding as well. One thing you can do, we have, is a homeless court. So that's a good option. We started that 2013. There's about a little more than that now. There's about 30 other jurisdictions that do this. And this is, I'm in attendance. I sit next to the prosecutor. So this is an opportunity to intercept the homeless. If you stay crime-free, work with me, then your charges get dismissed. This is all city ordinance violations. You're not going to go here for bank robbery or something like that. It's just another way to intercept the offenders by the time they're offenders and try and divert them from jail. Panhandling is particularly here. This is Mike. He was one of the first people I housed. He was such a prolific panhandler. He's on Google Maps. This is from Google Maps. Definitely arresting away the problem is not very effective. It's a good way to end up in court. So ultimately, you want to, same as any other homelessness, it's issues. It's about solving the problem and not the symptom. If you're arresting your way panhandling and homelessness, you're only addressing the symptom. If you were solving the issue, then you're solving the problem. So that's my thoughts on panhandling. Not all panhandlers are homeless either. It's only about 50%. I sort of call it the first cousin of homelessness. If you want some easy ideas to get going, I have a whole presentation on how to get IDs for the homeless. It's a barrier to housing, medical care, other services. We have a law in Florida where homeless get free IDs. There's no cost to that. And we get donations for birth certificates. This gentleman, John, who was living on the streets of Tampa for 3 years. I helped him get his ID. We discovered he had $42,000 in the bank that he didn't know about the whole time that he was living on the streets. He is no longer homeless. I see him pretty regularly. This is what got me in the People magazine for the first time. I've been in there twice. Herschel, I just helped him get his ID. He was born in rural Georgia and he never had a birth certificate. He legally did not exist for 61 years. And now we got into the Real ID Act where you have to have a birth certificate to get an ID. Well, what do you do when he doesn't have a birth certificate? I solved that and he now has an ID and he's no longer homeless. Outreach event. This is what we did. Actually, the police started this. Me and my colleague from the sheriff's office, we started an outreach. We bring all service providers together, and people can. It's a one-stop shop, and they can get help. Just be careful not to turn it into just people showing up for freebies. That's a good way to get them there, but ultimately you want to solve the problem and use this as an opportunity to link people with services. Ultimately, the goal is housing, housing, and more housing. That is the goal. Everything else should be working towards that goal. I'd recommend you partner with your continuum of care. Every community has a lead agency, which is required in the HUD guidelines. So the conductor of the local orchestra, they coordinate all the funding. They do the point in time count, which is required every 2 years. Most do it every year. They have the coordinated entry wait list, which is how you get into housing if you're homeless. And they operate the homeless management information system, which is the homeless social services database, which I have access to that. We're not allowed to use it for criminal justice purposes. We have a legal agreement to that effect, and we've never had an issue with that. And that's a common question, but the Homeless services, given the police access, has been a non-issue. We haven't had a problem with that. So I recommend, like my colleagues have mentioned, it's all about community collaborations, working together. The police can't be in a silo. You're not going to solve this on your own. You have to work with others. Particularly if you are looking at, I did a system mapping of, this is kind of the outreach process for the homeless outreach team, which homeless outreach is not really a process. It's more of a collection of process of navigating people from one step to the next. This system mapping is for Lee County, Florida, Southwest Florida, Fort Myers area. And in your community, it should look fairly similar to this. I'm a very visual person, so I did this to kind of show, like, what are the steps for the system? How do you get from A to B? Particularly if you're in law enforcement, you want to get into ending homelessness. This kind of provides you with a roadmap of where to go and kind of how to get from A to B. And one of the concerns I have is like I mentioned, alluded to before, there's a big difference between the homeless that commit minor nuisance crimes, often for life-sustaining activities, such as panhandling, urinating, and defecating in public, sleeping, camping, and criminals who happen to be homelessness. There's a big difference to that, and I want to make sure we're perfectly clear on that. I'm not out there to assist criminals if they're active criminals. Now, if you've been released from incarceration, that is, most of them don't have very good resources. I have helped many ex-offenders. I have helped people who've up to including murder who've done their time. They want to do the right thing, and I have helped them get into housing or get jobs, etc. So I want to make that clear that we as a police, we're not overlooking crime. We're certainly not overlooking major crime. We just want to develop solutions for the homeless who may be committing minor crimes rather than enabling criminals who may be homeless. That's a big distinction. So ultimately, here's the best slide, the last one, which is basically, this is kind of the elevator pitch about why you should solve the problem, not the symptom. Ultimately, you can solve homelessness rather than reducing the appearance of homelessness. You can reduce problems, or if you just enforce it, you're reducing the symptoms of problems. You'll notice on the right hand of the screen, it's all about reducing symptoms and the appearance, et cetera, reacting to calls for service rather than preventing calls for service. The criminal justice concept, you can divert minor offenders or just incarcerate them over and over again, hope for a different end result, which is not going to happen. I think we all know that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all about cost, and you're going to save a ton of money, reduce call for service, reduce complaints by having an effective homeless outreach plan. So that's kind of my elevator pitch there. It's a great money saver. You're going to reduce all the system resources. You're going to enhance your community relationships. You're going to avoid litigation and offer solutions, not explanations. And if you worked in homelessness before, you'll hear this often: make homelessness rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. It may seem impossible, but it is absolutely not. We know how to do this. There's no mystery to this. This has been done in many communities, including mine. Anyway, we'll save the questions and answers, I believe, till the end. And that's my contact information there. And I believe we're going to take a break now. So let me unshare this and hope you enjoyed that. There's a lot of information in a very short amount of time. So if your head is spinning, that's a good thing, because we can help you with all the other stuff after that. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. That's such a valuable perspective. I know that we have representatives of both the Jackson Police Department and the Hinds County Sheriff's Office, and representatives from the civilian government of both of those, city and county. And, Officer McDonald provides, quite a unique perspective that is directly applicable to a lot of members of our audience and also has a wealth of experience. So thanks so much. For now, we're going to go on a 10-minute break and come back, and we'll have some one more training and some closing remarks from Representative Zakiya Summers, and then we'll go to questions if there are any. Welcome back, everybody. Now we just have two last installments, and then we can go to questions. First up, we have Brett Frazer from the law firm Latham and Watkins. He's going to give an overview of the First Amendment and its relationship to homelessness. Brett?
Thanks very much, Josh. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here in just a second. While I'm getting this pulled up, I'll tell you a little bit about Latham and Watkins and my practice. Latham and Watkins is a global international law firm. We have over 2,000 lawyers across 22 offices, and we practice in just about every single arena. My practice and my day-to-day focuses on intellectual property litigation, so patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets. And I encounter the First Amendment often in terms of free use for copyrights or in the trademark context, although I do have an active pro bono practice where I represent a number of individuals or work on litigation representing individuals in state and federal court. Can you guys see my screen here? Yes? Okay, thanks. So the first thing I want to say is that I love the First Amendment. It was my favorite class in law school, and I find it fascinating. But I hope that this presentation won't just simply be an intellectual exercise. I want to stress, sorry, I'm trying to work this here. There we go. I want to stress that protecting the First Amendment is important, not just because it speaks to foundational principles in our country, but also because the failure to protect and respect the First Amendment can result in serious liability for jurisdictions that fail to do so. I have cited one example in this first slide from the city of Springfield in Illinois, in which a statute that permits plaintiffs to collect fees in civil litigation resulted in a jurisdiction being on the hook for $350,000. And so it's important to remember that respect for the First Amendment is not a theoretical exercise, but it is in fact important, and the failure to do so can result in financial penalties. So now let's talk about the First Amendment. There are what are known as the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment: religion, speech, press, assembly, and the freedom to petition. All of these are important. We'll be talking about speech and assembly today. This is a picture of James Madison, and for those of you who don't know, James Madison is one of the founding fathers and former president who wrote the First Amendment. Commercial solicitation, which is the type of speech at issue in panhandling, is protected speech, and it is protected by the Constitution as explained by the United States Supreme Court. And this has been held over and over again in multiple jurisdictions across the country. Now, to dive into the weeds a little bit and to kind of explain the details, content-based restrictions on speech are presumptively unconstitutional, whereas content-neutral restrictions on speech may pass constitutional muster. So what does that mean? You know, I could cite cases for you and I could kind of explain this in a professorial fashion, but there's a to understand whether a restriction is content-based or whether it's content-neutral. And the test is, if you are on patrol or you are about to engage in an enforcement action, do you have to listen to the speaker's message before taking that enforcement action? If you have to listen to the message, then that means the restriction is content-based, because some of that content will not result in an enforcement action, and some of that content will result in an enforcement action. In an enforcement action. To use a realistic hypothetical, imagine if you are on patrol and you are determining whether to take an enforcement action against 2 different speakers. One of those speakers is a Girl Scout seeking donations to her organization or attempting to sell cookies, and the other speaker is a person without a home soliciting a donation. If you have to listen to those before making an enforcement action, that would be a content-based restriction on speech. Well, in that case, both of them would be commercial solicitations, but one of them would come from a homeless individual and the other would not. And so the thing to keep in the back of your minds is if it's a content-based restriction, then it is likely unconstitutional, or at the very least, it is presumptively unconstitutional. Speech does not have the same protection all the time in every place. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with the platitude that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. So what that hypothetical is meant to tease out is that while you can be in a public park and scream the word fire, there are certain places where speech may be subject to heightened scrutiny. Relevant here in the panhandling context, sidewalks, streets, and parks are what are considered traditional public fora. And speech enjoys heightened protection in these traditional public fora. So these are places where there's been a long tradition of assembly and of people exercising their right to freedom of speech. So because a lot of panhandling occurs in these traditional public fora, that speech is not only subject to presumptive protection as an initial matter, but there's heightened protection because of where that speech occurs. The First Amendment and the freedom of, well, I should say the freedom of speech is not only protected by the First Amendment, it's actually also protected by the Mississippi Constitution. And I've included here a quote from the Mississippi Constitution: "The freedom of speech and of the press shall be sacred." I include this here because there are some cases stating that the freedom of speech afforded by the Mississippi Constitution is actually more powerful and broader than the freedom of speech afforded by the United States Constitution. So Mississippi is a state in the Union that actually has very robust protections for freedom of speech. I rifled through that pretty quickly. That's actually the end of my presentation, but I'll obviously be on to answer any questions, and I'll pass it back to Josh.
Great. Thanks so much, Brett. I think that it's important to remember in the, over the past year, there's been a lot of marches, protests, people exercising their First Amendment rights. And I know that law enforcement across the country and in Mississippi and in Jackson and Hinds County have gotten training and gotten directives about, how to deal effectively and within the constitutional bounds with that type of speech. It's important to know to point out, as Brett mentioned, that the same constitutional rights that protect protests and marches also applies to other speech on the streets, including speech by homeless individuals. So with that stated, that is actually the end of our substantive presentation. And Representative Zakiya Summers, whose district includes parts of Hinds County and also Rankin County, she's going to give some closing remarks. Zakiya?
Hi. I think that there's a screen still being shared, but thank you so much, Josh. And I wanted to give special thanks to all of the presenters today, the National Homelessness Law Center, Latham and Watkins, Officer McDonald, and a special thanks to the ACLU of Mississippi for bringing us all together and hosting this training. Also want to thank all of the participants. Thanks to Jackson Police Department, Hinds County. I believe Miss Onetta may be still on. I want to thank her. Supervisor Calhoun is on. Definitely want to thank him, as well as Keisha and Marcus from the city of Jackson. Homelessness is a priority issue, not just for me as state representative, but we've also see it be prioritized by Hinds County. And I'm excited to hear that the city of Jackson is also interested in prioritizing this issue in a way that would be proactive and helpful to a community that is often marginalized and forgotten about. As Josh said, I represent portions of West Jackson, South Jackson, and you all know that we see a large amount of homeless individuals in this area. Many of them are dealing with mental health issues. And so all of that is compounded, which makes them homeless insecure. And so I'm just so grateful that we were able to have these presentations to hear from a national perspective what we're dealing with, but to also see a model of something that has worked, that is working in Florida, and something that we may be able to tap into in terms of resources. Back in the fall, I had a call with supervisors from Hinds County, as well as representatives from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that also provided models that help homeless individuals get back to work, help them to do things that the city needs, like beautification projects that would give them some income, but also provide them with the services and resources that they need to get housing and become full citizens once again. And so I think there's an opportunity here for us to coordinate services on various levels, city, county, state, as well as nonprofit organizations like the ACLU of Mississippi and others, in order for us to provide what we need to this community. As someone stated earlier, this is a human rights issue, and I just want to leave you with this, is that when we are encountering homeless individuals, that we remember that they are someone's relative. They could be someone's mom, dad, son, daughter. They could be one of our relatives, one of our friends, our church members, and they deserve dignity and respect. And so as we move forward, I am looking forward to working with you on a win-win solution for both the city, the county, and the state. And I do believe, as Landon said earlier in his presentation, that the city of Jackson can be an example for the state of Mississippi on how we provide services and resources to the homeless community. So thank you again for the opportunity to be a part of this. And I look forward to working with you as we go further.
Great. Thanks so much, Zakiya. We're happy to have an elected official such as yourself and a leader on many issues, including on this issue. If we just look at, the panelists here and the people in attendance, if we were to take just this group and, hopefully we could get more, but just this group has a lot of power and influence to make a big impact on this issue in Jackson and Hinds County. And given the central nature of Jackson and Hinds County, that could, be expanded to the Jackson metro area, hopefully. Now, I'm going to open up everyone, all the attendees, to be able to speak. Before I do, there was a question in the chat that I want to raise, and this is actually for Officer McDonald. And the question is, how did you, Officer McDonald, respond to outside agencies or jurisdictions bringing homeless individuals into Tampa for services? Did you find that to be an issue? And how did your team handle that?
It's not a real big issue. It happens from time to time. It's usually not an organized effort. I think the biggest offender is a city to our east that has a lot of theme parks in it. I won't say them by name, but and it's not the city. It is an organization that does that. But we get this from time to time. Usually when someone arrives, and this is for someone that is new to homelessness, but not necessarily just someone that arrived in our jurisdiction. Most will about 70% will self-resolve their issues within 14 days. So I'll point them in the right direction. If I can give them some guidance, I'll help them with that. Where can they go for a shelter? Where can they get jobs, etc. If they are close by, such as in the state of Florida, if they have a support system where they came from, and we may pejoratively be heard of as homeless dumping or greyhound therapy. If they have a support system, I'll link them with that, and they can go back to there or point them in the right direction. And the biggest issue I have is volume of people that need help. A busy month, I'll get up to 1,800 phone calls, or about one every 9 minutes. So I have to kind of pick and choose who I can help and prioritize, and usually it's going to be people who are local, and then the others will kind of have to work on their own, at least for a little while. And then they still need help after a couple of weeks, and I'll kind of do some more work with them. But ultimately we want people to kind of self-resolve and go from there, which most of the time they do.
Great. Well, thanks for that answer, Dan. I've opened up the Zoom So everyone now is able to speak. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Good morning, Hinds County Board of Supervisors, Tristia. Yeah.
Well, it seems like based on that, there's no questions or comments. So, you know, if someone still wants to chime in, please do. But it looks like JPD has unmuted. Did y'all have a question or comment? If somebody from the JPD room is speaking, it's really it's the audio is not coming through. We're still having difficulty hearing from you. Well, I mean, you know, I have everyone's emails, or at least the contacts' emails. You know, I can, you know, I just posted a Google form in the chat box that links to a survey that you can. It's very brief about today's training, and I'll also email the survey to everyone that I had been in contact with. And with that, you know, I want to thank all of the presenters for giving this varied and you know, relevant, helpful comments and advice and experience on the issue of homelessness. And I want to thank all of the attendees for joining. And should you have any questions, we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.